to see it. Okay.
Right.
So we are live, folks. I'm Chris Hewitt. We're here with the Hudson Valley Current, and as part of our livelihood news and our desire to share information about abundance and resilience, we've created this week of talks. We're calling them 5 at 5, and today's theme is dollars and inequality. Our guest is Shaniqua Bowden from the Kingston Land Trust, and one of her projects is called Land in Black Hands. Today is a discussion on things like managing scarcity. When we don't know about something like the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, or how the dollar was accepted as the global currency in 1944 through the Bretton Woods Agreement, we lose out on understanding how dollars create poverty. A conversation around serious topics like compounding interest, usury, redlining, and other racist financial policies, the unbanked or underbanked, and New York's potential inclusive value ledger. We're going to be talking a lot more tomorrow about the inclusive value ledger with Assemblyman Ron Kim, but we're excited to be talking with Shaniqua today. How's it going, Shaniqua?
Going great, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be interesting.
Yeah, and we have Keyvious Avery here, a colleague of mine. He always helps to keep the conversation lively and on track. Thanks for joining us, Keyvious.
Of course, I love to talk about dollars and inequality, you know, as we're at the precipice of creating local currencies and employing inequality and employing equity. So Shaniqua, I just want to know from both of you a background on what makes value, before we dive into the question of how value was taken from people. What is value and what do we see as valuable in this society? And Chris, maybe you can talk about reciprocity and the value in that.
Sure. Would you like me to start?
Yeah.
One thing that got me involved in the Current, and I think publishing also, is the idea that everyone is so interesting. Everyone has value, and when we can get to know somebody, we get to understand their value as a human being. And so whether you enjoy doing art or telling stories or watching children or taking care of your elders, there's something we all have that brings value to society and worth to our own self and our desire to care and love about ourselves. So my desire is to use money, raise money, and run an amazing organization and create collaborations in order to share value and highlight the value that's all around us, which is one of the reasons and ways I was able to become friends with Shaniqua. She's focused on similar things, highlighting beauty and abundance and working in Kingston with the Land Trust to share information everyone needs. So it's great to see you, Shaniqua. What do you think about value?
Well, I think in general, you know, value is like a belief system. And we value many different things in our society. And I guess that's what makes us most different. It's the things that we value, you know, like with our friends, things that we value in common that allow us to bond with one another, right? And then some other folks have different values. They don't believe that bartering is a real thing or it's something of value. They only want to rely on the dollar and maybe the old systems and paradigms that exist. And so that's how I think about value myself.
Beautiful.
Shaniqua, can you touch a bit on those old systems and paradigms that may exist and how value may be stripped from individuals in those systems? So whether we're talking about redlining or Chris, I know you know a lot about underbanking, overbanking, whether we talk about those topics on how the old system, strips people of value.
Well, redlining is, well, they like to say it's something that's an out-of-date system that was used to keep people of color from achieving land. But I believe that the system is still in existence, as I myself have had a very difficult journey trying to become a homeowner. And I mean, in the end, I had to go outside of my very own community to a community that was more diverse, and it was almost like more accepted for people of color to have land in that community or to be homeowners in that community. So therefore, I could consult someone who was also of color to help me through the process. But right here in my very own backyard, it was so difficult for me to overcome the challenges of becoming a homeowner. And that's still the case. No, and that was, so redlining is a technique that was used. I guess I call it a technique, whereas they did not want people of color to move into certain neighborhoods. And just in general, if your name came up on an application and it turns out that you're a person of color, it was very unlikely that your application would even get approved. And I'm sure, Chris, you can shed a lot more history on redlining.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it was actually a red marker that was being used by bankers and real estate agents to say, well, the Bronx was destroyed. They didn't mention what destroyed the Bronx, but it was actually Robert Moses and the Cross Bronx Expressway. But once it was destroyed by horrible racist infrastructure, then you had destroyed communities, and bankers and real estate agents would take a red marker and circle it and say, do not lend any money within this circle. So that is the redlining beginnings. And then it became more formalized, where the red lines were actually going around whole neighborhoods and zip codes. And so it was both a way for them to determine who to lend to and who not to lend to. And because of insurance fraud, and also, I want to get back to compounding interest, because that's something that can strip people of their own value, exorbitant interest rates. But in the 70s, when I was just born, and then into the 80s, I always heard, don't go to New York City, it's burning. The Black people are burning the Bronx down. And because they can't handle their land. That's the narrative that I was told in White Long Island. But it turned out it was the Jewish landlords burning their own buildings to get the insurance. Me and blame an enemy, to say, well, it's going bad, let's blame it on somebody else. But turns out the truth comes out. I keep hearing this week, Keyvious, through these talks, that what is hidden in the darkness will come out in the light. And that's why I believe what we're experiencing now is a great awakening, where we have to have these kinds of conversations. And I'll talk briefly about the stripping of value. When you make somebody broke and you force them to become more broke over time, they feel powerless and they feel like they're not worth anything. And so if you give somebody a loan, let's say $1,000, very simple number, and you owe that money back over time, but you owe $1,500, you have to work really hard to earn that extra $500 to pay back in interest. But now let's talk about the purchase of a house. My wife and I are still paying off this mortgage for decades, and the interest payments are what we have to pay first. They want us to pay them their interest first, so that they don't have to take any risk. We have to take all that risk for 20 years. And then I start paying the principal off. Well, compounding interest is interest upon interest. And this happens in scenarios like the International Monetary Fund, where let's use Burma as an example. When Burma was taken over by a military dictatorship, that dictatorship changed the name of the country to Myanmar, changed the village names, changed the street names, and that is a form of oppression, to change people's perception of themselves and their country. Well, Myanmar applied for loans from the International Monetary Fund, and then they give them the loan plus interest that's so high it can never be paid back. It's impossible. But a dictatorship took on that loan. The people didn't agree to that loan. So why are the people locked into that debt? The dictator forced them to be locked into that debt. The same things happen in our ghettos and our slums, in any low-income neighborhood. People are forced into deeper and deeper debt through interest. And then they get frustrated with the system, and they become what you mentioned, Keyvious, unbanked or underbanked. Because if you don't trust the man, and you think of the man as not only the police, but also the bankers and all the powers that be, why would you open a bank account? The man is going to take all your money. And so then you develop in your community, I'm being told by my neighbor, just go to the check cashing place. You can get your money from them instead of a bank. But then that place takes 1/3 of your money every week. They're taking 1/3 of your money. So if you don't understand money, you're being taken advantage of. So that's why these conversations are so important. How are we valuable? How are we each valuable? Just because you're in debt doesn't make you less valuable.
Chris, you're touching on a great point that hits home for me. As an econ student from, low income neighborhoods, I never had an understanding of money until, I was given the chance to have a college education, right? And really dive deep into economics. And that speaks a lot, and I have members of my family who are both underbanked or unbanked because they don't trust. And you touched on something that was very vital is that, and what we're seeing now in the system of inequality is, okay, let's say redlining doesn't exist. The effects of redlining still exist. And the mentality of people like me and the mentality of people that look like me and in ways of us trying to achieve a home loan, to someone that doesn't understand money, who has to get a loan for a house, who doesn't understand credit and whose family has never built credit, that interest rate is going to be higher on me, even though I have like not a substantial seat in the economy. Like, even though I don't have as much money, even though I don't have as much impact in the economy, it's easier for people who've acquired wealth than it is for folks who were kind of put on the back burners, as history shows. And I want to touch briefly on the underbank and where do we find wealth in this country, because 81% of landowners after 1970 that were Black lost their lands because they never created a will. And the reason they never created a will is because they weren't supported by banks, which goes back into the idea of redlining. Banks weren't supporting these people. And that goes back to, where do we get wealth in this country? When we talk about the Hiltons, we talk about the Trumps, these people that amass a substantial amount of wealth either has had land in this country, or they have had opportunities to capitalize off of land, or go into a space or strip people of their land, or acquire credit so that they can purchase land and then capitalize off of. And Shaniqua, I want to know a little bit more about why the Kingston Land Trust is important to you, and the value you find in the land, and why is it important to put land back in Black hands under this topic of dollars and inequality going forward?
Well, I mean, the Kingston Land Trust is an organization that conserves land or protects land. Let's say we protect land, right? We protect open space. Because we're in an urban environment, we protect open space for people to use. There are some land conservations out there that you think they're just in the existence, on behalf of the land and not so much on behalf of the people. And that is because, so in the, the history of conservation, usually you want to keep a place protected from being developed. So the Kingston Land Trust, however, being here in Kingston in a small urban environment, we kind of value open space for people who need it. And then when you look at people who have been historically fragmented and kept off of the land, we're generally talking about people of color. So with that, we're figuring out, how can we be more instrumental to those populations? How can we, instead of developing ways to keep people off of the land historically, how can we mend those relationships with the land that have been lost? And that's when you get to like more of a spiritual type of realm that we're crossing over into. And it's new for us. I've come on and I've recently been, my title's recently been changed to the cultural and community engagement captain. And so with that, my job is mending those relationships in a more spiritual way. And that's also when we engage, the indigenous people who have taken care of our lands for so long, and it's ironic nowadays that, we are talking about permaculture and all these ways of being kind and gentler and more conscious of the land, which is something that, Native Americans were doing for generations before we came along. And now here we are recreating the wheel, pretending as if it's something new, So.
Yeah. And also, I love that your workshop you put on at the United Methodist Church during Black History Month, your Land in Black Hands Forum, taught me a lot and helped me realize a lot of things. Like, I was going to ask you, why would anyone want to keep Black people off of land, for example, when since slavery, the main purpose was the relationship that African Americans developed with the land. They were the ones who got the benefit, the honor of being in the soil every day and really developing a relationship that then again, whites in America shoved aside, just like Native American knowledge.
Exploited and stole. And so let's also remember that these particular Africans were brought here to do their work. And then some, I'm getting into a long history where you know, there were also people of color here already on the land. But let's just say the folks that were brought here because of their skills, because they were already farmers and they already had a relationship with land from where they were coming from. They were already masters of seed and etc. So that's why those people were chosen to come here and do the work that they did. And yes, so they worked for X amount of years, and now that you don't need them anymore, you know, as tools, now they've been just discarded, and it's heart-wrenching. I mean, when we look at the Great Migration, we're looking at so many people whose families were kicked off the land and threatened, and lands were burned, you know, and colonies were burned when people tried to create their own systems and own ways of working with one another just to get on their feet, you know, when they were set free. All of that was taken away, and folks, you know, as a result, there was that Great Migration where so many of our grandparents, like I remember when my grandparents left North Carolina. I mean, I don't actually remember it, but I remember the stories of how they left their homelands to come to New York. And, you know, and here my grandmother is, and she's a master of cooking and, you know, working with food and so on. Of course, you know, all that we get from the land. And she has that Southern accent still, you know, and every time I speak to her, you know, you just wonder, like, so Grandma, why aren't you in you know, Greensboro, North Carolina, where you grew up as a little girl? And there goes that story, you know, of how they were kicked off the land, and everyone was told that if they went north, you know, that's the promised land. That's where they will accept you. That's where you can get jobs. Instead of the land that they knew and loved, you know, and cultivated for so long.
Yeah, I've heard this story. It's funny how in society there's a story that evolves, and I guess they could be called memes. Like when I mentioned that everyone should have health care, people sometimes have the knee-jerk reaction. You mean like Canada? We'll be standing in line. There's always this knee-jerk reaction that actually comes from the pharmaceutical industry. They spread that rumor. They spread that message so that oh, we don't want universal health care. We'll have to stand in line, you know. And so another one that I've heard from a white friend this week is Africans sold the Africans to the whites. It was the Africans' fault, right? To push blame. But I just did some amazing reading about what is Benin today. The modern country of Benin was really a slave port that many different kingdoms in Africa were sending their most talented people, like you said, Shaniqua, the best fishermen, the best farmers. And in war, because there was tribal war, they would steal those great talented people and send them to Benin. It was the kingdom of Dawani or something. And that's where the whites would come with their ships to pick up all the slaves. Well, that didn't get created out of thin air. It was created by demand, and the whites created the demand, which made someone in Africa who was money hungry say, let's fill this demand. And so it was a system of oppression that led to that demand. And I never realized that they were seeking out the talent. They were looking for the best farmers, the best fishermen. That's amazing. And then, like I mentioned on our show yesterday, the Clotilda, the last slave ship to make it to the States that we know of, in 1808, the United States agreed to no longer import slaves from Africa. And so all slaves that were being traded existed in the States already, in theory. There was some illegal shipping also. But in 1860, these brothers said, we could do this illegally. Let's go to Benin and get 125 slaves. We'll prove to the world we can get new slaves, right? And the penalty for doing this was supposed to be hanging. Well, this guy and his brother got away with it. They brought 110 slaves back. 2 died in the horrible conditions on the journey across the ocean. And we all know those horrible stories of the lower decks. And so 2 people died on the way over. Well, when the brothers were caught, they were tried, they got out on bail and then freed. A story that we see over and over. It should be the death penalty, but you know what? We're going to let you go this time.
The injustice, yes.
Yeah. And then that was in 1860 when they arrived. And so they only had to be slaves for 5 years. And that is a beautiful story of Africatown in Alabama, where they still had their culture so strong because they were only here for 5 years. They grew up as Africans. They did not want to learn English. They're like, we're going to make our own town here. They bought land from the guy that stole them in the first place. They earned the money, you know, and then that led to the movement. It was actually a Republican movement to free slaves and make laws around equality. So that's the story we hear of the 40 acres and a mule. Sherman helped create a program to divide 40 acres for all freed people. And then the Democrats at the time, who were pro-slavery, slowly dismantled those programs. And so like you said, Keyvious, maybe the land was offered, but how long could the land be kept if you can't afford to keep it, or if you don't put it in your will, or if you don't understand the implications of land ownership? So the Democrats helped dismantle that whole social structure that was built after Civil War. And then we got racist policy after racist policy, including white supremacy that I've always thought was a concept. White supremacy, whites think they're better than others, right? No, it was actually laws around white supremacy to act like supremacists.
Yeah, isn't that
Crazy.
something?
Yeah.
It's almost like, how can you fight it if it's the law? It's the same conversations I have with folks today about, you know, things that we need to change, things that if this wasn't in existence, or if this particular thing wasn't a roadblock for us, we could all live. You know, for instance, I've been in many conversations about tiny homes, you know, and it's like, oh, well, you know, if the municipalities would allow for tiny houses on this property, we could all live. We could all just live in a modest way. And so talk about changing the law to make this, you know, thing allowable. But then there are so many people who are standing in your way to say, no, we uphold this law. And it's like, but why? You know, did you really look at it? Some laws are meant to be amended and or changed for certain reasons. I mean, so if we never change the laws, you know, like what is it, 3/5 of a man or so on, you know, even though some of these laws are still in debate today. But if we never changed or amended even some of them, we would still be in the same exact position that we were back when.
Yeah. I was in a town board meeting last week. I'm on the town board in the town of Rochester, and we were discussing our procurement policy, how we buy things from subcontractors, whether it's carpentry or air conditioning. And we adopted something called best value, because in New York State, it's the law to take the lowest price. And I argued the lowest price is not always the best option. And so you can create a new law called best value. And then we had to create criteria. What is best value? A local producer, someone who's from near here, you know? And in this conversation, we put this language in the law that says, and we encourage women and minority-owned businesses. And a colleague of mine, a young woman who is well-read, Councilwoman Erin, says, minority owned? Isn't that an outdated way to say it? And I go, yeah, in 2030, the minority shifts in America. And then the supervisor's like, well, that's just state language. We have to go with what the state tells us to say. So we're gonna just accept minority owned as a term when it's inaccurate. Or a peace officer is what we call our local cops. They have a gun, they're peace officers. Well, it's just what we call them. It's not peaceful.
That everything in law is not necessarily, you know, correct, or that it should be there, right?
Right. We have to make changes. We have to evolve. And that's why I love these conversations.
Shaniqua, speaking of evolution, you talked about a spiritual evolution. Can you talk more about, you know, the precipice that we're witnessing or that we're a part of as far as spiritual evolution? And Chris, could you follow that up with reciprocity and the idea of everyone being involved, and how we shift from being individual agents to collective agents in the community to address inequality?
All right, so the best way I can explain the spiritual evolution is, I mean, I'd love to use the Native Americans as an example, but then there are times where we feel very disconnected from that narrative. So the best way I can explain it in today's terms is almost like the respect that has been lost in looking at the land as a commodity and how we treat it. It mimics the respect that was lost when we looked at people of color as a commodity and the way we were once treated. Not that today is like 100% better, you know, we're still working on it, but it's that relationship that we're talking about. It's that respect that it's been lost that needs to be recaptured. If we looked at the land as the relative, you know, that it is, as the mother that is always reliable, always holding us, always feeding us, always cradling us, always taking care of us, giving us sun, food, water, air, all that we need to exist. And we respected her the way, you know, she should be respected. We would not treat the earth the way we do. We wouldn't have the issues that we're having with our carbon footprint and emissions and just saying like, oh, you know, don't worry about what we toss into the oceans today. We'll figure it out later. You know, I just think that there's a huge loss of respect for the Mother Earth. And if we have that back, I think it's something that we really need to focus on. And some people are able that have that spiritual connection and know that we are all connected and we're humans having this experience here on earth and you know, just plugged into that divine message. Some people are already doing that, and some of the rest of us just need to get a sense of what that is. And I think that we could be in much better relationship with the land.
Beautiful. You reminded me of somebody I heard speak, I think it was over 10 years ago. Her name is Ramona Africa. Have you heard of her?
It sounds familiar. Maybe I heard it from you.
Yeah, maybe. But she was a survivor of the bombing in, I think in Chicago during the what was it? The Democratic National Committee when the riots happened in Chicago in the 60s or 70s. Well,
Go ahead.
The police used that as a ruse and a trick to bomb the Black Panthers headquarters in Chicago. And she was in the building when it was bombed. Well, when I heard her speak, I was blown away because she said all of the world's problems and solutions are related to one word: respect. If we could just respect each other, respect the earth, you know, like if you think of one problem, she said, give me problems. I'll tell you how it relates to respect, you know? And I respect people a lot. I love people, even the ones who don't like me. It could be difficult, but I have to change my perspective about them sometimes and think, well, how does their mother see them? Or if there's a God, how would God see that person? Because God or the mother probably see that person in a positive light, even if I have a hard time with it.
That's very true. I think a lot of the respect that I developed was from becoming a mother. It's just the way that you look at your child, the way you look at this being that you have no control over in the making, you know, and you have to love them regardless. And you do already. It's just an innate feeling. And so, yes, a lot can be learned from being a parent. And I think that's part of what just appalls me on a regular basis. I just can't understand, like, you know, the things that comes out of maybe Donald Trump's mouth every now and again. You know, you're just like, wow, are you someone's parent? How could you have less love for anyone else, you know, after having children? You already know the process. You've been through it, you know.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it makes me wonder as a dad, does every dad have unconditional love for their children? Because if you do, it's hard to be mean to other people, right? If it's unconditional, right? But we are here, it's almost 5:30. We have 15 more minutes with Shaniqua Bowden from the Kingston Land Trust. I'm Chris Hewitt. I am the director of the Hudson Valley Current, and my colleague here is Keyvious Avery. He is an economics student at Bard College who's joining us for the summer at the Hudson Valley Current. Shaniqua Bowden works with the Kingston Land Trust and is an expert in community project creation and coordination, entrepreneurship development. She is helping to allocate community resources. And she serves as the outreach coordinator, but as we just heard, her new title is cultural and community captain. That's pretty cool. We're here talking about dollars and inequality. Keyvious just asked us about value and reciprocity. For me, for reciprocity, meaning the give and take of value. For me, that's also not only about unconditional love and respecting people and seeing as much good in them as I can, it's also for me about judgment. And Bob Marley was a very early influence on my life. When I was 14, I started realizing that oppression exists. Before that, I was protected in a white bubble of privilege that I didn't have to know that oppression existed. I didn't have to know people suffered and struggled to eat every day. I didn't have to, I was protected from that. And so when I was 14, Bob Marley helped me see it on a global scale. And then that helped me discover Peter Tosh, his bass and guitar player, is even more badass and more of a rebel than, like, he calls himself the stepping razor because you got to watch his stride. And so I learned so much about people and respect, but also I say reggae has three main themes. One is being aware of oppression, one is love and romance, and the other is marijuana. And so all three are great songs, and they cover those really well. So one thing, and also spirituality, because they always quoted the Bible, and Rastafarianism is based in Christianity. And so one line that I always remembered is, while you talk about me, someone else is judging you. And that's like the Bible saying, judge not lest ye be judged. And so I was confused. What does that mean? Just judge not lest ye be judged, or someone's judging me because I'm judging. And then as I got older and think about it, every time I judge someone else, if I call them ugly or stupid or lazy, I'm judging myself because I'm comparing them against me. They're only ugly compared to how handsome I think I am. So I'm making judgments about myself to keep someone else down and making myself feel better by hurting someone else. So that's when I realized, you know, you can't run away from yourself. And it's another song that I learned from Bob Marley. And so to be a great person is to respect everybody. And so again, we respect the Mother Earth, Shaniqua, and part of Mother Earth is each one of us. We're made of the Mother Earth. And that's what I love about reciprocity, Keyvious. That was a wonderful question.
Yeah, you touched on a really great point. I want to tie this into everything that was discussed. One, this new shift into how we spiritually look at the world, from taking view of us as independent agents of the economy to a holistic view. And I think that highlights two of the big problems that are, the fundamental, what makes the dollar and why we have inequality now. The first is that, there's an individual approach to engaging in the economy that we all exhibit. And that approach goes down to how you view the world. When we talk about Donald Trump, someone that's become very rich off of this individual approach, but also very impactful with their words off of this individual approach. That in turn further creates a divide and further creates inequality, which we're not only witnessing in the world, but in the economy. And the second thing that we're witnessing is this communal aspect being taken away from us, where we're losing money in the community. So Chris, could you touch on Hudson Valley Current and what the Current aims to do as far as bringing the community together, and how that $300 Current line of trust and the reciprocity it takes to earn it back to zero? What does that speak to, that new spiritual shift that we're witnessing?
Well, I'll start by addressing what you said about Trump being very rich. My question is, how happy is he on a daily basis? Is that guy happy? I don't know, and I don't care, actually. Sorry, I was being judgmental. Okay, so, but what I love about the Current is you can't become rich in currents just because you're rich in dollars. You have to earn the currents, you have to work with your hands, you have to offer a good or a service. And one of my favorite things I ever heard Shaniqua say was when we were making grass baskets at the Kingston Point Beach with Circle Creative Collective. And we're all sitting in a circle. They had already taught us how to make the baskets. And as you're working with your hands, it gets quiet. And there's no need to fill the awkward silence because your circle is building something together. Nobody has a desire to jump in or make a point or interject. And later I heard Shaniqua on Nubian Cafe talk about how suddenly as it's quiet and you're using your hands, you realize I'm making friends. I'm sitting here making friends, being quiet with no conversation, but using my hands. And so the reciprocity to me is about relationships, how we see each other, how we value each other again, and how even if I am a publisher and my main thing that I sell is advertising, I can also participate in making a basket sometimes. So for me, reciprocity is about just being engaged as a human on a daily basis in our community and not feeling so desperate to always pay the bills and always be in a rush to pay that next bill and earn that next dollar. Because when we're abundant as a community, we don't have to rush to make money. We keep it here. We are the money.
And Shaniqua, what value in people have you found with your work through the Kingston Land Trust? And, you know, when you get to work hands-on with so many valuable people in Kingston, just like what things have you learned as far as their contributions to the community?
Well, recently at our Land in Black Hands event that we had this past Black History Month in February was amazing. There were so many folks. I invited like loads of people in, all in, what do you say, like land professions to the table. And so we all came together in a circle, and not only did we watch the previous year's video, you know, and hear some words of wisdom from farmers that are already out there in our region doing things, but we also got to share ourselves and a little bit about ourselves and our resources as a community. And it was just amazing. We almost didn't get through to the end of the circle because our region is so rich with folks and all the things that they all had to share. And in that circle, we also had the rice farmer. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar, but we have a rice farmer here in Ulster Park. And he came all the way from Africa and settled here in our region to grow rice. And so it's called the Ever-Growing Rice Family, Ever-Growing Family Farm, the Ever-Growing Family. And he was just there sharing stories about his grandfather and his father and how he was always working. And it was just a really beautiful story. But it's nice to have the ability to reach people like that and have them share stories with you. I mean, it's almost like I will always have that story with me, even though I haven't spent any time in Africa. You know, I will always have his story. And then just to know that he is local right here. I mean, what a relationship. And I'll go on to say that recently that particular farm had some heartaches where the main farmer, his name is Famara, he got stuck in Africa due to COVID and wasn't able to come back to the Hudson Valley and, you know, for this spring to start the to start planting rice. And through the Land in Black Hands group, his wife was able to reach out to our group and share the fact that she needed help, you know, down at the farm. And this would also be an opportunity for other folks to learn how to plant and eventually harvest African rice and all the steps in between, which is like amazing. So I can't tell you how many responses I got for all the folks that were either so happy to reconnect with them because they haven't done so, you know, via the pandemic. We haven't seen each other since February. And folks were just elated to be of service to that family, you know, and that's the relationships, that's the type of aura we're trying to cultivate through Land in Black Hands. It's like what Chris said, even if you don't necessarily have money to give, you can give your labor, give your heart, give your love, you know, and equates to even more.
You know, I loved hearing his story at your event because of how much of a celebration the planting and the harvesting is. It reminded me of Native American seed songs and seed harvest and harvest dances. It's a tribal relationship with the land that he was describing. And he said, please come down and celebrate with us. It's like a celebration when we do the harvest, you know? And I also got to meet a wonderful woman at your event. And I don't know if you know Desiree Lyle. Did you invite Desiree there?
I do. I did invite her. She is an inspiration to me as a person who, you know, her journey, you can share at whatever point, but yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, she has a book about her family, which is wonderful. But in our desire to really, for me, to challenge myself to be a new type of business person, to embrace all types of people when I hire, to share wealth in all regions of our community. I was trained as a white businessman, and there's a certain way white businessmen are trained. And I didn't realize that as part of white privilege, I was being blind to the whole rest of the world. And as I was trained in undoing racism, I realized that that's called gatekeeping. And we can be good gatekeepers. We could be healthy gatekeepers. And so every writer I've ever hired was white. And so I had to start asking myself why. And it was my fault. It was my lens. It was what I attract, right? And so to meet Desiree that night and learn that she is all about social entrepreneurship for women, I was like, oh, I've been meaning to meet you for years, you know? And so I'll share my screen quickly. She's now one of our feature writers. And this is the June issue, the food security issue. Desiree wrote phase 1 of reopening your business as a female entrepreneur. And so I love all of her articles. They're fantastic. And her beat for our Good News publication is women-owned businesses, women entrepreneurs, inspiring women, especially people of color, you know. And so when you have a chance, everyone, you can check out livelihoodmagazine.org, and Desiree's piece is right on the website. When you go to Livelihood, if you click the June 2020, all of the articles for all of June come up, and they're always good news about keeping money local and strengthening main streets. This issue is about food security, so really, really great articles about food and all of our ability to step up during COVID to help our neighbors. So where does that bring us, Keyvious? Oh, you're on mute.
Chris, if I may.
Yes, absolutely.
A cute story, quick story. I recently was cleaning up, you know, my coffee table and, you know, doing some sweeping and so on. So Sunil brings to me a Livelihood magazine from like back in December. And I'm looking at it and I said, wow, I didn't get to read this one. This might be the one that I was looking for that I misplaced. And even though it's old, you know, it's an older issue, I'm looking at the articles and they're always so good. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. I'm like, I have to go through this. I have to read it. There's always good information. It's really engaging. I have to commend you for that work. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate it. I like to call that evergreen because our news never gets old. It never, you know, like the trees, the leaves never fall off of our news.
Yes, I love it.
In fact, I was gardening and I use a technique called sheet mulching, which uses either cardboard or newspaper to go on the soil once you plant and then mulch on top of that. You get almost no weeds. It's instead of using that petroleum landscape fabric.
Yes.
You know, I use newspaper. I had a 2011 copy of Country Wisdom News, which is what Livelihood used to be. It was great. From 9 years ago. I'm like, we wrote this? And so it made me think, I think we need to revisit our content from 9 years ago. Just bring it back. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Evergreen.
Yeah. And that's the goal of Good News. It never gets old.
I know we're about at the tail end of this, but I just want to circle it back around for the folks to remind them of the conversation about dollars and inequality. You know, through this discussion, we learned that inequality is present when you have systematic oppression that allows for advantages for certain people, and when you have, and when people adopt the individual impact view into the economy. So what we're witnessing now, and we talked about the spiritual transformation, is the current and a complementary currency.
You went mute for a second there.
Oh, sorry, but everyone can go negative, but it takes reciprocity where everyone, there's no advantage. You have to work together as a community in order to uplift each other as a community. So I thank you all for this discussion. I think we've learned a lot here. Christy, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I just wanted to, because I think we have one more minute. We're here with Shaniqua Bowden from the Kingston Land Trust and Keyvious Avery. I'm Chris Hewitt. I wanted to go deeper into the idea that I believe it's interest itself that creates inequality and poverty. And we didn't get to go deep enough into that. Because if I get a loan for $1,000 and Keyvious, you get a loan for $1,000, and we both owe $1,200 back over time, that means we need to earn 200 extra than the 1,000 we borrowed. Well, that 1,000 we borrowed is created by the Federal Reserve when we sign a promissory note. The Federal Reserve and the banks create the $1,000. They never create the $200 that I owe back in interest. So where does that money come from? I have to work harder than somebody. And if I do, someone's gonna get more poor. So it's my fault that poverty exists. Any one of us who works hard and can pay back our loans, good job, but we're making other people poor. So the system is built to create poverty. And that's why I brought up at the beginning, managing scarcity. Whoever manages the scarcity has the wealth, because they could tell us there's not enough to go around and keep the rest for themselves. So let's remember, we're abundant and we're here for each other. And that what money is really just a representation of how valuable we each are. So I love that I'm in community with you, Keyvious and Shaniqua, and I can't wait to have more conversations like this.
Thank you. It's been a great time.
Likewise.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Shaniqua.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Bye, Keyvious.